This may surprise some of you, I suppose, but I don't really describe myself as being much of a risk taker. That's an interesting term, I think, risk taker, because it's one that kind of changes definitions as we get older, right? Like when we're young, we tend to think of risk takers as guys like Evel Knievel riding his motorcycle, jumping a bunch of school buses, or those guys who go skydiving off of skyscrapers, if you will, or we think about guys who go bungee jumping over canyons. But as we get older, risk-taking starts to take on a much more broad definition. We set the bar for risk-taking down, and sometimes significantly. Now as adults, maybe risk-taking is guys who invest in Bitcoin. Maybe risk-taking is eating the leftover Chinese food in the back of the fridge, even though you don't remember the last time you had Chinese food. Or we even look at risk-taking as when our children decide to touch the thermostat, assuming dad's not going to do anything. And if you give me a second, I'm going to talk to just two people here today. Don't touch my thermostat. Your sister gets a break because she's in the nursery, but don't touch my thermostat. But again, I'm not much of a risk taker myself. In fact, I would still say that probably the biggest risk I've ever taken in my life is still when I asked Mandy to marry me. Not that I viewed the act itself as a risk. I kind of knew that she was going to say yes, but it's still kind of scary when you make the decision to get married. I've told you the story already of how I proposed to Mandy, and about 2 weeks from now is actually going to be the 17th anniversary of the actual day in which I proposed to Mandy, so that's kind of exciting. What was that? Well, you'll hear it sometime. Anyway, give me time. But the thing of it is like, again, I kind of knew what the answer was going to be. And for me, relationships really all through my dating experience were something of a risk. And I've kind of alluded to the fact that dating wasn't exactly my strong suit. But when the first girl I ever told I was attracted to her laughed in my face, kind of made it a little more cautious, maybe a little more overly cautious when it came to anything of matters of the heart. And so when I knew that Mandy was the one, I thought, hey, all my big risk-taking in relationships is over. But what I didn't realize was that actually when I came to the point where it was time to ask Mandy the question, that I was actually up for a little bit more risk. Because there were some other people I needed to involve in the conversation beforehand. The first was actually my own parents. I felt I needed to kind of give them some heads up of, hey, your son is about to make a really big decision here, and I want you to be aware of that. But I had kind of assumed, like a lot of us do, that when I was going to tell my parents that I was going to ask Mandy to marry me, that they were going to tell me a lot of the same stuff that most parents would tell their kids. Like, you're too young, you're not quite ready yet, she could do way better. Just stuff like that, So the way I decided to tell my mom was I handed her a folded up picture of the ring itself, and I went to the kitchen to go get a bottle of water because I thought if I'm going to have a fight with my mom, I'm going to be hydrated for it. But as I came back in the room and mom kind of knew what was going on, there was no fight. Turns out both my parents love Mandy, and they really wanted me to lock that down. In fact, I think my mom actually said, "What has taken you so long?" And we'd only been dating for 1.5 years, so, that felt pretty good. So it was kind of nice to know that a situation where I thought there was perceived risk wasn't really a risk at all. But there was still one more conversation to be had. See, it was really important to me to get Mandy's parents' blessing over this entire thing, and so I knew I had to talk to them before the big ask. And so one night, I drove the 2-ish hours from my house to Mandy's parents' house. And it wasn't until I was about 5 minutes away that a thought crossed my mind. I had gone 1 hour and 55 minutes on this drive without this thought crossing my mind, but as I'm getting close, the thought crossed my mind, what if they say no? Oh boy. See, the thing is, I knew how I felt about Mandy. I knew how Mandy felt about me. I had no idea how Mandy's parents felt about me. We hadn't really spent a lot of time with them. And most of the time when we had it, it all had been for like bigger family things. And so now this essentially a stranger is coming by to ask, hey, can I marry your daughter? It's going to be fun, right? So I'll never forget, like, as I got there, my hands have probably never been as sweaty as they were in that moment. And I got to the house, and Mandy's mom actually leads me into the living room where her father is there watching television. And at no point does he ever look away from the television to acknowledge my presence in the room. If I thought my hands were sweaty before, somehow I worked up enough courage to kind of share with them exactly what was on my heart. I told them how much I loved their daughter, how I wanted their blessing to make her my wife. And I just kind of poured my whole heart out in front of both of them. And then it got real quiet in the room. The TV was still going. My father-in-law was watching the Speed channel because he's a car guy, and that's about all I remember. I couldn't tell you what was on the Speed channel because I was really nervous, especially as it got quiet. I laid out my heart. I put it there in front of all of them and waited to hear their response. And I swear to you, I can picture what happened next just as crystal clear as if it was just last night that this happened. My father-in-law, who again had not looked away from the TV, suddenly turned and made eye contact with me. If I thought him not looking at me was bad, somehow this was worse. And as he opened his mouth to say something, I braced myself for what could possibly be said next. And no matter how much I had prepared myself, there was no chance that I was ready for what he was going to say. Because my father-in-law turned at me, looked me in the eyes, and said, and I quote, if she ever hits you, hit her back harder. And then he turned right back to the TV. I don't think I've ever been more confused, because out of the pantheon of responses that I had tried to brace myself for, this wasn't on the list. And I looked at my now mother-in-law and she could just tell that this 20-something kid is just befuddled by what he has just heard. And she says, that means he likes you and you have our blessing. And as the moment sank in, I found myself completely overjoyed because I had just taken a huge risk. I'd borne my soul in front of these two people who I kind of knew, not really well, and it had paid off. And I was so overjoyed, in fact, that I was terrified they were going to change their minds. So I bolted out of that house like it was on fire. And about a week later, I asked the most important question that I've ever asked anybody. There's something about us as human beings that when something is a perceived risk to us, it is a moment that can feel completely terrifying. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel like we're putting everything on the line. See, as human beings, we like sure things. We like kind of knowing how things are going to turn out. We like knowing what the outcome is going to be. We like knowing what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and what's going to happen every step along the way as we look for that final destination. We like to know what's going to happen. Anything that could feel like it might disrupt our current plan, it feels like a risk. It makes us nervous. It makes us uncertain. It makes us feel like we don't know what's going to happen next. And so because of that, we feel that fear of the unknown. We have this need to know how things are going to happen. And so because of that, most of the time when something feels like it is a risk for us, we will shy away from that. There are a few times where we'll be willing to take a risk, and sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't. But oftentimes the times that it doesn't hurt so much the next time we're even more gun shy to do so. We like safety. We like security. And there is safety and security in staying away from things that feel like they might be a risk to us. But here's the thing. No good story ever feels safe all the time. right? None of the best stories that you have in your life involved you staying at home and watching television. Nobody ever found their new favorite dish by sticking to the same restaurants that they go to all the time. Nobody ever had those stories that are worth telling and retelling over and over again if the main character does not feel like there's any sort of peril at all in the situation. If you read a story about a guy who just nothing ever happens to him, well, that's boring. And so we're not going to retell those kinds of stories. And that's why I think that nearly 3,500 years after his death, the story of Moses is one that continues to be told and studied and dissected and even modeled after. Moses had an intimate relationship with the whole concept of risk. And even before, he was the one making those decisions that could be risky. The entirety of Moses' story really it revolves around this notion of risk happening. Risk being taken and whether or not those pay off for them. So if we ever take a step back and look at all of this, we can kind of see that there is a lot of moments in Moses' life where there is a risk that is taking place, and yet somehow he overcomes that risk. Now, similar to last week, I want to give you a little bit of heads up here that we're going to try to cover a lot of ground. Really, we're going to be staying in 3 chapters today, but there is so much more about the life of Moses beyond that. Pretty much Exodus through, Deuteronomy, or whatever. My brain's not working right now. But the next 4 books of the Bible are all Moses. And then Moses gets talked about in almost every book beyond that. So the life of Moses is one that has such significance on us that we can't cover everything that's going to take place. But I would tell you, like last week, if you're unfamiliar with the story of Moses, take some time this week and at least go through the book of Exodus. But for today, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1 through 3. So if you want to get there in your Bibles or turn there on your apps, wherever you want to do that, that's cool. But really in Exodus chapter 1 is where the risks in Moses' life get started and even before he is born. It's kind of wild for us to think about. If you recall from last week, Joseph rose to a really important and prominent position in all of Egypt. Right? We found out that after he was sold into slavery, somehow through a course of series of events of his life being built up and then destroyed, and built up and destroyed, Joseph somehow found himself as the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. Maybe the most unlikely of stories to have ever happened to a person, but it paid off for Joseph in the end. And the story of Joseph and Moses are actually connected in ways that we oftentimes don't talk about. See, because as Joseph being second in command of all of Egypt, once he reconnects with the family that he had been estranged from for decades at that point, he does something that makes a lot of sense to me. He says, hey, we're in the midst of a famine. You guys might starve to death. I'm really powerful over here. Why don't you all move here with me? So he relocates his entire family, all of his brothers, his father, everyone, and he brings them to live in Egypt with him. And in Exodus chapter 1, we are actually alerted to something in verse 8 that's really important to set the stage for Moses. Because it says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. See, the thing of it is as Joseph's family came to Egypt, they started having kids. Lots of kids. And then those kids wound up having, well, you get the picture, right? Generation after generation, this whole group just expands. And in fact, they're actually expanding faster than the Egyptians around them. And so this new king, we're told that after all this takes place, he makes a decree. Because he kind of has this moment where they're expanding so much that he thinks, we've got to do something about this particular thing. These guys, they don't owe us any loyalty. They might choose to side with an invading force. And so he makes a decree after all of this has happened that the Egyptians should enslave the Israelites. That they should force hard labor upon them, making them work countless hours that maybe they'll be too tired to continue to grow in population. But that didn't work because they continue to grow at a faster rate than the rest of the Egyptians. And so after that takes place, when this didn't work, the Pharaoh then told the midwives, that when they are tending to Israelite women, to the Hebrew women that are there, if they give birth to a boy, kill it. Fresh out the womb. Nice guy. But here's where the first risk in the story of Moses takes place. Because for some reason, these midwives, they don't want to murder helpless babies. Weird, right? And so it says in verse 17, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Understand, these midwives are taking a huge risk here. They've been told exactly what to do by the most powerful man in the nation. And they are choosing, I fear you, but not nearly as much as I fear God. Right? Most dictators aren't exactly known for being level-headed individuals. Right? If we get a level-headed king, we rarely ever hear about that, right? That guy doesn't make the news all that often. It's the guy who goes cuckoo bananas with power that we tend to hear about. And Pharaoh, being a dictator who has just already issued a decree that if it's a male-born child, kill it, doesn't exactly sound like he's well-balanced, right? And so these midwives are kind of taking a risk in defying the orders of Pharaoh. Because he could very well just say, well, you're done. And eventually Pharaoh starts to realize, I'm still seeing newborn Hebrew male children. Why? And so he brings the midwives together, and they come up with an excuse that is just, oh, it's perfect. I love it. It's ridiculous. I kind of want to get like one of those inspirational canvases made up of just this verse because it's just fantastic. And we see it in verse 19, This is the excuse that they give him. The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian woman, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. These ladies just pop them out too fast. We're going to go tend to them, and we hear a outside, and then there's a baby. Who knew? Any woman in who's ever given labor... Was it 10 minutes for you too? Yeah. I love it so much. They're too fast for us. But here's the thing. Don't sleep on the first part of verse 20, because verse 20 I think is absolutely huge to us. See, the midwives took a risk. They took a risk trusting that God was somehow going to handle this situation, that he was going to protect them, that he was going to guide them through this. They're taking a risk by defying the king. And in verse 20 it says, so God dealt well with the midwives. They took a risk. And God saw that. And because of that, he honored them. He blessed them. And the Israelites continued to expand in the midst of all this. But after the ordeal with the midwives, Pharaoh decides to go to the next level. He says, if the midwives aren't going to handle the situation, I'm going to put it into the hands of all the Egyptians. He says in verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Boy, this guy just sounds like a peach, doesn't he? Not long after this decree, there's a Hebrew woman who winds up giving birth herself. And again, I want to pause for just a second because for a lot of us in this room, we have heard the story over and over and over and over again, right? Okay, cool. Maybe you saw it on a flannel graph. Maybe back in the 70s, you learned about this through puppets. Puppet ministry was huge in the 70s and 80s, so I still maintain that we should bring it back, but I love the Muppets, so that's me. But this is a story that we hear so often that we kind of know how things are going to go. But I want you for just a second, before we read the verses of what this mother does, I want you to try to put yourselves in her shoes, to think about what is taking place in Exodus chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. It says, the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds in the riverbank. Again, this is a story we've heard over and over again, so we know the ending. But for this woman, this is a very scary time for her. Right? She gives birth, and I mean, like most mothers, she sees this newborn infant and she immediately falls in love. And she wants to do whatever she can to protect him. She knows what the decree of Pharaoh is. She knows that she's not supposed to keep him. She knows that it's a very real possibility that somebody else may intervene. And yet she tries to hide this newborn infant. Now, I don't know if you know this about babies. Babies cry. Babies make a lot of noise. Babies tend to get attention. And so you got to think that for those 3 months that she is trying to hide her child, that every single day this woman and her husband are looking over their shoulders. All the time. They are in a constant panic state. When that kid wakes up in the middle of the night wanting fed, they're rushing as fast as they possibly can to get him to be as quiet as they possibly can because they don't want the neighbors to hear because we don't know if we can trust them. Every waking moment is spent in anxiety and fear. Because what if somebody finds out? And after 3 months of this taking place, of sleepless nights, of constant state of alertness, of just being physically and emotionally exhausted in the midst of it, they decide, we can't keep doing this. And so they come up with an idea, and it's, I think, actually kind of a brilliant idea. Pharaoh's decree was to put the babies in the Nile. He didn't say you couldn't put them in a basket first. And you got to think that as they are crafting this basket, they are doing everything they possibly can to make sure that this is as watertight as possible. But the moment that you put the baby in the water, you are taking a huge risk. We're talking about the Nile. The Nile is one of the most powerful rivers in the world. That current could pick up in a moment's notice and take that basket away further and faster than we ever thought possible. Worse, maybe we didn't patch up the right holes. Maybe there's a small leak. Maybe there's going to be a little bit of water that gets in there and our son is going to drown. We don't know what's going to happen. But we're going to trust that God is somehow going to take care of this baby. And so even though it's a risk, we're going to go ahead and put him in the water. Can you imagine if it was your child? And again, we kind of have the benefit of knowing what happens next. Things work out, and they work out in a pretty significant way because not only is the basket with the infant found, it's found by the daughter of Pharaoh. And the daughter opens up the basket. She sees a beautiful baby boy. And even though she recognizes him to be a Hebrew, she says, I like this baby. Understand, this is the daughter of Pharaoh, the guy who made the decree. So kind of she's taking a risk in and of herself by saying, I'm going to keep it. But she raises up Moses in her household. In fact, the name Moses itself actually means drawn from the water, which I love. She named him after what exactly happened as she found him. My mom named me from a romance novel. And not a good one. Remember when names meant something? Anyway, but this is a beautiful moment. He gets to, not only is he alive, not only does he get to live beyond when he was supposed to, he gets to grow up in the lap of luxury in the household of the most powerful man in the nation. As far as a situation going well for parents who trust in God in that moment, I don't think it gets a whole lot better than that. We're going to hope the kid lives. Not only does he lives well. But Moses is always aware that he is a Hebrew, that he is being raised in the household of the man who has enslaved his people. You got to think that this creates a lot of conflict and a lot of tension within him as he grows up, right? Because he recognizes I'm a Hebrew, I'm growing up in the lap of luxury while my people are being forced into hard labor, who are being beaten, who are being tormented by these people. They're the ones who are building Egypt into a national or a worldwide powerhouse. But they're not going to get the credit because they're the servants. And this tension eventually continues as he grows up as an adult, and he comes across the situation that tension comes to a boiling point. Exodus 2 verses 11 and 12 tell us one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, I want to pause here for a second. On the one hand, I applaud Moses' willingness to handle a situation. On the other hand, this is murder. Right? At the very least, it's manslaughter. So what Moses did, well, we kind of understand it. At the same time, it's still the wrong thing to do. There were other ways he probably could have handled that situation. But he thinks he's gotten away with it. But you and I both know he did not. Somehow someone found out about what Moses had done, and word begins to spread, and eventually it actually finds its way all the way to Pharaoh himself, and we see the results of that in verse 15. It says, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Again, remember, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household. He grew up in the lap of luxury. He knew when he was going to eat. He knew it was going to be prepared by somebody else. He knew he didn't have to clean up after himself. Somebody else would do that. And now he is fleeing as a wanted fugitive into a land he does not know. That's a risk. That is a risk that he is taking by going into the land that he does not know as a wanted fugitive. But after, according to tradition, about 40 years of living in Midian, God himself would approach Moses with something that had to feel like the biggest risk anyone could ever ask of anyone. Right? We talked about the situation not all that long ago, so I'm not going to rehash everything beat by beat because we've done that. If you missed that one, it's on YouTube. I don't remember which sermon it was because I stopped thinking about those sermons and start thinking about the next one once I'm done. But Moses is out in the middle of nowhere. He's tending to his father-in-law's sheep, presumably while his father-in-law is watching television, not making eye contact with anyone. At least that's how I like to picture it. And he sees a bush that's on fire, but it ain't burning up. And he thinks, well, I got to see this thing because, he's a dude and that's what we need, right? Guys, we see fire. We want to go check it out. Am I wrong? Yeah. It's exciting. While he's there, God speaks to him through the bush. That's weird. That's weird, right? Objectively. I'm walking up, this bush is talking to me. I need to get some sleep. And God tells Moses that he wants him to go. And he gives Moses a command in Exodus chapter 3, verse 10. And this command is rather risky for Moses. It says, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." God has just told Moses that he is to go back into Egypt, the land where he is a wanted fugitive, go and tell the now new Pharaoh, the guy who is still the leader of the country where he is a wanted fugitive, and tell Pharaoh that he's going to take the Hebrew people out of there, the slave workforce that has made Egypt into presumably the most powerful nation in the world right now. I don't see how you don't consider that risky. And Moses, I think justifiably so, he starts coming up with reasons as to why I probably shouldn't be the one to do this, right? He tells God that when he says God has sent me here, absolutely nobody's going to believe him, right? If some random dude just shows up and says to you, God told me I need to tell you something, I'm going to be a little hard-pressed to buy that right away. And so God tells him, well, take your stick and throw it on the ground, it'll become a snake. Because that's a normal thing to happen. So he tells God, well, I don't speak very well. And God reminds him, I'm the one who made your mouth. It's going to be fine. Moses again says, I really think you should find somebody else. And God says, get Aaron and go and do what I told you. So even though it's a risk, even though he has no control over what's going to happen or what Pharaoh's going to say or what Pharaoh's going to do, he has no knowledge of what's going to happen. Again, we know what's going to happen. We have the benefit of hindsight. But as Moses is living this moment, he has no idea what's going to take place. He finally just decides, all right, I'm going to let it go. And I'm going to trust that God is going to do something in the midst of all of this. And again, we know what happened. We know the end result. God does incredible things. Not just in the moment when he's with Pharaoh, but he does incredible things throughout the rest of Moses' life. He not only frees his people, he shows the entirety of Egypt the power of God. He watches as God himself wipes out the entire Egyptian army after God had separated the water with Moses holding his hands up. That's a weird thing, right? Again, we get so familiar with these stories that we normalize things that are strange. Moses goes, whee, and the water separates. And then God says, drop them. And it drowns the entire Egyptian army. It's weird. And yet this is the stuff that Moses gets to see. He also gets to lead his people towards the promised land of God, the promise that had been made all the way back to Abraham himself. Something that had been talked about for centuries at this point amongst the Hebrew people. This mythical, magical promised land, Moses is the one who gets to take him close to it. And there's so many other times in his life where Moses takes even a small risk and God rewards that. Because over and over and over and over and over again, as Moses surrenders more of his control in the midst of it, God does increasingly incredible things. How are we going to eat? I got it. What? All right. We wake up and there's bread on the floor. Hey, I'm getting a little tired of bread. I'd like some meat. All right, I got it. Now there's quail. I imagine bread and quail gets a little tired after a while, right? I ate a lot of chicken growing up to the point that now I have to be in a very specific mood to want chicken. Or it's got to be prepared a certain way. I will always take a smoked bird every time. But this is the stuff that God does in the life of Moses over and over and over again, because more and more, as God asks Moses to take a risk, Moses doesn't view it as a risk, because he knows that if I'm willing to surrender this, that God is going to see this through. It's such an incredible, powerful thing. The thing of it is that surrender will always feel like a risk to us. It's always going to feel somewhat dangerous for us to truly surrender our lives, ourselves, or like we even said last week, even just surrendering our pain, something that we know we ought to give up, something that we know we ought to let go of. It is still difficult for us to let those things go, to surrender those over to God, because surrender always feels risky. But do you know why? It's because when we choose to surrender, to finally let these things go, it means we no longer have any control over it. The reason surrender feels like a risk is because it means we no longer have control over the situation. And that makes us uncomfortable. Again, we have this ingrained deep, hardwired into our brains thing that says, I have to be in control of every situation, of every moment in my life. Right? But in our faith, we are asked to surrender our entire lives to Christ. And I don't know if I know too many Christians who are really good at that. A couple I could point out and say, I'm pretty sure that guy is pretty good at this. I ain't. I am not one of those guys because I feel this need to control everything. And so in order to give Jesus Christ reign in my life, to give him control over every course of my life, it feels like a risk. But let me point out something about our perceived sense of control. Because the thing of it is, the truth of it is, our sense of control is an illusion. It is always an illusion, and it has always been an illusion. We think we have control over most of our lives until something comes along to prove to us we had no control to begin with. We think we've got control over our lives, and then the doc comes back with the test results. We think we've got control over our entire lives, and then one day our spouse isn't at home anymore. We think we have control over our lives, and then that car pulls out in front of us. Or the person that we love most in the world breathes their last breath right in front of us. We think we have control until something comes along to shatter that illusion. Why do you think it is so annoying, so upsetting, even so heartbreaking when the plan that you have gets disrupted? It's because that disruption has just proved to you that the control you thought you had, you did not have. The truth is that we have no control over most of our lives. In fact, James himself points out some of the how futile our sense of control is. There we go, I found it. I only speak for a living, it's fine. James discusses the futility of our sense of control in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we shall go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit, yet you don't know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are just a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." But here's the thing. When we surrender control, it was so easy to say out loud, but when I stopped to think about what that actually means, when we surrender control over to God, understand that what we are doing is we are giving control to the one being who has ultimate control over everything. Right? We're talking about a God that the Bible describes as having spoke the world into existence. You ever considered that? I say a lot of stupid things. None of it has ever manifested right in front of me as soon as I've said it. I'm going to lose 40 pounds. Nope. We are talking about a God who has demonstrated time after time, in Moses' life even, that he has control over everything, including the things that we claim are uncontrollable, like, I don't know, water. We're talking about a God who is powerful enough that if he wanted to, he could just say it, and it's all done. And you and I can't do anything about that. And when we surrender control over to God, we are surrendering control over to the one person who actually has control. It's a difficult thing for us to wrap our mind around. It It's so hard for us to understand that. But the story of Moses shows us that when we surrender our control to him, he can and will not only protect us and show us that he is worthy of that trust, but he will also do incredible, dare I say it, impossible things in front of us. All it requires of us is a willingness to surrender. The midwives chose to surrender to God instead of Pharaoh, and God blessed them for that. Moses' parents chose to surrender their control over Moses' future, and God set him on a path that would eventually free his people, including his parents. Moses chose to surrender his control to God, and not only did he free his own people, he had a front row seat to, I think, what are inarguably the coolest moments in the Old Testament. Is it easy to surrender control? No, don't be ridiculous. I think that's why Moses kept giving God excuses as to why he can't. But when we do, like when Moses finally did, when we are finally willing to take that risk, to trust God, to surrender our control over to him, we're going to find out it really wasn't a risk to begin with. And I believe that there is no more freeing emotion until that finally clicks for us, that when we realize that what was once a perceived risk wasn't a risk to begin with. Because God's got this. In Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 through 25, Jesus says this, and we will close with it. It says, "Then Jesus told his disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it.'